Hey everyone, good evening. This is Perspectives, a thought leader initiative by Kiwani. We kickstart this year's webinar series with the topic, the importance of lab standards from a user's perspective. Well, we all know effective operations in any industry depends on sound principles of safety, quality, and compliance. Laboratories are no different. But does too much of safety, quality, and compliance harm customer experience? Or could too little control end up in a disaster? That's a common balancing act problem. And that is why we have with us today Dr. Sridevi Bashyam. Sridevi has over 20 years of professional experience, and she has been associated with Syngene for the last 16 plus years. Currently, she is the Deputy Research Director and Head of Discovery Services Operations and Infrastructure at Syngene. In her current role, Sridevi is responsible for strategy, development, and execution of operational initiatives. And Sridevi has completed a postdoctoral from Arizona Cancer Center, USA, and PhD from Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur. Sridevi also has more than 25 publications to her name. We are privileged to have her with us today. For the next hour, Sridevi will be discussing on the importance of lab standards that help to drive effective operations. At the same time, she'll also help us understand how to be a customer-focused partner without compromising on the principles of safety, quality, and compliance. Before I turn the stage to Sridevi, just a little housekeeping. Please stay on mute and don't raise your hands during the presentation. As the presentation is on, if you have any questions in your mind, you can type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. I'll bring up your questions during the dedicated Q&A session once the presentation is over. Now let's turn our attention to Sridevi. Sridevi, thank you for joining, and it's a great pleasure to have you with us today. We are super eager to hear from you and your experiences. So let's get started right away. All yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vijay, for that overwhelming introduction. A warm welcome to all of you. Yeah. So I think you're aware of this housekeeping rules. Apart from that, I would like to stress that wherever you are, whether you're attending this webinar from office or at home or wherever you are, be conscious about your surroundings so that in case of any emergency, you know you're aware of the emergency exits as well as the nearest assembly point. With that, I would like to start off why lab standards are important. Why do we think that lab standards are important? To start off, I would like to quote, give a story about Madame Marie Curie. You know her, that she is the person who has got 2 times Nobel Prize in the department of, one in department of chemistry, one in department of physics. And she's only person as well as the only woman to have got that Nobel Prize twice. And, you know, she did a really breakthrough discovery in terms of, you know, about the polonium, radium, and the theory of radioactivity. Of course, the discovery was really breakthrough, but you know, like when it was evaluated how she died because of her exposure to radiation. And in those days, that many safety measures were not there, and the labs and the standards were not established. And you know, we also hear some kind of incidents or injuries, fire and explosions happening around our area, be it Bangalore or Mumbai or outside India. So these kind of incidents alerts people to look into the safety very thoroughly. You know, we want to have a safe and hazard-free environment. So these kind of incidents also alerts people that the existing standards are still not sufficient, means we need to strengthen our safety and quality standards. So what is our ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is to go work, play in a safe manner and come back home in a safe manner. So from this webinar, what is the purpose? So we'll discuss about some sustained best practices. We are going to, this will help us in attaining an incident-free environment, and automatically outcome of these two things will be the state-of-art facility. Now the process, of course, the means is through the presentation, and also I'm going to share some real-time experiences with my 20+ years of experience, and then the payoff, what you're going to definitely have a very better understanding on the lab standards, and also to manage, understand and manage risks. So in today's webinar, we are going to first go through a small video as a safety sharing, and then also talk about how unique is R&D and its risks and challenges, a little bit about the inventory management, quality and equipment standards. So once we establish the standards and the best practices and procedures, we need to sustain those practices. That is most important. So for a success of any company, and the key takeaways, and then we'll come to the question answer session. So I'm going to share with you a small video. Sorry. Yeah, that video is self-explanatory. I don't have to talk about the video. Well, we'll come to this topic of how unique is R&D. So, the corporate leadership has a very clear understanding about the manufacturing processes. But when it comes to R&D, the clarity on how to manage risks is kind of lacking. See, R&D can lead to a lack of field implementation and hands-on support for scientific teams. R&D is kind of left alone to determine, how to comply with the hazard identification, be it hazard identification or risk assessment, or even trade secret management, or business continuity, or even security processes. That personnel may not even have the knowledge and skill if he has to operate a very complex equipment, and he may not have that in-depth knowledge to operate it safely. So because of this, R&D has received less focus, and sometimes most of the times what happens is that processes established for manufacturing are often overlaid into the R&D. We see that in terms of quality as well as in safety practices. So let's see, ideally, what in reality the challenges and risks faced by the R&D. We will just go through the processes. In manufacturing, most of them are fixed process, that, the process conditions are all well established, and the change, we don't tend to do the change management very often. Whereas in the case of R&D, there's going to be like frequent changes. We deal with unknown compounds, our processes, everything, I think, change in a very frequent manner. So even sometimes we need to do some hundred or thousands of experiments within a month or within a year. So that is the major difference. And in terms of material, you handle in large volumes, and we don't use that often. But whereas in R&D, we use very small volumes, but there is a wide range of chemicals or whatever. And incidents in manufacturing, as you all know, it can be catastrophic, but it will also impact the community as well. The severity may be lower than in manufacturing, but still it can be severe. And it can affect the business continuity in also the pipeline. Now, teams are all well qualified there. The risk understanding also is, over the period of time, it has evolved. Whereas in the case of R&D, we do have people with highly qualified with PhDs and postdoctoral people working on the R&Ds. But when it comes to the core R&D processes, with respect to safety and quality, there is less awareness. And in case of equipment and facility integrity management, there the processes are all well established. Whereas it is there in terms of quality, but safety, in terms of safety perspective, we have to really have a deep dive in. So these are basically what we think is the difference between the manufacturing and the R&D processes. And if you see, uh, the um, the level of risk with respect to laboratory workers, it's not that it's a less risk. We do have some level of risk there. And even in case of scientists, or be it medicinal chemists or organic chemists or biologists, where they're responsible for drug development, and we still have some level of risk there. So what are the kinds of risks and challenges? Like, the potential for fires and explosions, unexpected chemical reactions, asphyxiation or hazardous waste, exposure to toxic, chemical and biological or radioactive materials is very inherent of R&D. And there's also high IP related risk, as well as challenges with respect to regulatory compliance, supply chain management, and also the business continuity along with this risk. So if you see, in the earlier scenario, what people used to, the customers were more oriented on the product delivery. As long as if they get the product delivery, they are quite happy with that. But the scenario has changed totally in presently. The customers don't see us as just a delivering partner, but they see as a collaborator, more of a collaborator, and partnership is established between the client and the customer and the company. So when it comes to, our when we start with the cradle to grave concept, wherever when there is a raw material generation storage, there it starts, where we do our reactions, or be it activity, any experimental activity, where we need to see not only the products but also the byproducts, how we are storing the products, how what kind of waste is generated, what kind of waste is emitted, and are we, seeing exposure to our people, environment, and the disposal process, how the shipment of that particular material has to be done, and the transportation. All this is kind of looked into. And when it comes to the client's aspect, there it is also with respect to transportation, storage, and everything is being checked. Like, the clients are all, they do, customers, they want to know how it is going from the generation to the shipment, and after going to the clients also how it can be commercialized and the disposal. Everything has to be kind of now they even while the RFG generation, that is the request for quote, when they request for quote, that time only they see from end to end what is happening and how things, so that when it comes to a big pharma, they will know that how this product can be kind of easily the compliances with respect to FDA and all that are kind of met. Now that we have seen uh, the risk model, will move like slowly into the based on this risk model, the hazard classified controls also, like we do different types of known or unknown process, more of new processes we keep doing. So if with the help of DSS, who has the legacy of 200 plus years of experience, Syngene has engaged them as partners, and then we have also they have helped us in handholding to identify the various types of risks with respect to labs, with respect to workplace, be it emergency management or mindsets and behaviors, or be it lab processes, or be it infrastructural. We have handholded and then arrived at some processes which is more suitable to R&D. It's not like, if you take a manufacturing, we do have a laundry list of things which cannot be pushed into the R&D. So there are, like, when we evaluated this along with them, then we saw that wherever the hazard is not involved, it's a routine process. You just have to take two or second look to see and then begin work. Whereas we have also classified this into a low hazard, moderate hazard, and high hazard. Depending upon the hazard, the controls and approvals can vary from one hazard to another hazard, and accordingly have a kind of checklist and begin the work. Because, for our R&D type of work, the risk cannot be eliminated. It cannot be mitigated at all. We need to manage the risk. So in order to manage the risk, how effectively we can bring the kind of practices, at the same time make our place safe. So you are probably you're all aware of this control practices. Whenever we have to have the elimination, that is wherever we are, like we need to work on some types of where the product can be eliminated, we can eliminate that process. And then comes, if elimination is not possible, we can substitute. For example, we found in our experience, we had to use some kind of N-butyl lithium, which is highly pyrophoric material, where those material can be replaced with a more N-xyl lithium, where it is not a pyrophoric at all. So those kind of substitutions is possible. And in case of any modification required with respect to infrastructure, engineering control, definitely that kind of things should be taken as a modification. And when I say the containment, there are some designated areas. For example, when we are doing some band 4 or band 5 type of compounds, how those can be contained, how those isolators, how can we develop a contained zone, where be like even hydrogenation type of reactions, how can we have an isolated area and controlled area, and how we can improve on the infrastructure, and which is related to also the ventilation aspect. And the work practices is more of what kind of procedures, SOPs or documentation, the decontamination procedures, what kind of administrative controls you put into that, so that, and finally it comes the personal protection. The personal protection of PPEs is at the end. Once if these 6 elements are kind of managed very well, then it comes to the PPEs. So I'd like to shift gear a little bit on the inventory management. So on the inventory management part, sometimes it is becoming very difficult to manage things in in a organization like CRO, where we have multiple clients and multiple requirements, and we deal with multiple types of products and raw materials. So what is more important here is like on-time availability. When it comes to on-time availability, like the best procurement policies, that is just-in-time delivery policy, and then information about the real-time status. What are we, how can we staggerly make the shipment available to the user? In the sense like, in case of just-in-time contact, like people, the vendors are ready to even have an open PR and then stagger the delivery. So on also like, in order to have this thing, the user have to have the easy access of the inventory details, what is, and repetitive ordering of these chemicals or whatever should be controlled by centralizing the inventory. So this will help in decentralizing, helps in more accumulation of the chemicals or the materials. Centralization helps in effective on-time availability and better management of inventory. And next comes the safe storage and effective sweeping. So the safe storage, when it comes to safe storage, we have to categorize our chemicals based on their reactivity and compatibility. We did a very elaborate exercise because there might be chemicals which are of different categories. We need to identify those categories and then accordingly segregate and put it in different buckets or bins. In that way, we are kind of not mixing the pyrophoric or explosive or exothermic materials, so which will lead to incidents. And of course, the GHS standards, we have the 6 categories of the GHS standards, which has to be followed and which has to be kind of helps the people in terms of the safe storage. And the labeling system, I think this is very important when it comes to labeling, but because the mix and match happens when in terms of identifying the raw material, and for this we need a very strong tech team to support the inventory guys. So coordination is very much required. And the storage capacity, the maximum allowable quantities according to the NFPA standards has to be followed. And sometimes we can also even think of outsourcing the warehouse and externals. This strategy can be thought of, to reduce the risks in our workplace. And one more thing is the effective, in order to have an effective sweeping, even though the chemicals don't have a definite expiry period, some of the chemicals, we should have an effective ways of sweeping. Otherwise, the accumulation of these chemicals or materials will lead to some kind of incidents. So here what I want to, like, while construction of any building, we always have to have a conscious of maintaining the flammability levels. So when it comes to labs, like before we were just, having labs in the 6th floor, 7th floor, 8th floor. So I think according to the NFPA standards, we should be very cognizant of the fact that up to 3 levels, this is the change which has been brought in 2019, like where the solvent levels, the storage of solvent levels, you can see that if in case of maximum quantity, where in the solvent of minimal fire hazard, this has to be maintained 570 liters. Whereas in case of that too in a contained area. What I mean by the contained area is controlled areas, like where the fire protection system is available. That is the sprinklers, fire extinguishers, and hydrant systems, where the true ceiling, the wall goes up to the true ceiling. So though that is a contained area, and the minimal requirement what to have a minimal fire hazard is 570. But if you go above the 3rd floor and 4th floor, the volume can go down up to reduced by 50%. So people need to be cognizant of this fact, like when we are designing our buildings based upon the activity we are doing. I would like to share one case study here. What we did in Syngene, like when we evaluated the labs and we classified them to, depending upon the labs, the what kind of how many solvents. Initially, we had some labs where we are handling more amount of solvents. For those cases, we use this just-in-time concept and centralized inventory and some infrastructural changes where we brought the risk of, where the red zone was 2 here, where the red zone was 2 here, we were able to bring down to 0, and we were able to increase the green zones very drastically. So the things are possible, but we need to think of the strategies how we can bring about this change. So moving to chemical hygiene. Chemical hygiene has a 7-element program. So when we are having in a discovery environment, an R&D environment, dealing with unknown compounds is very common. Like we deal with so many kind of unknown new chemicals, and it involves unknown hazards. So reviewing this chemical evaluation of this chemical is very much required so that it can be communicated properly. This communication, I think the point number 2, 3, and 4 are kind of interlinked, where whatever the hazard with respect to a new chemical, how this is communicated, whether it's a teratogen. What I mean by teratogen is whether it is affecting the people's like reproduction organ. So whether are we handling a band 4 type of compounds or band 5 type of compounds. So all that should be clearly, we should be aware of those and communicate to the, and in SDS, if you see, there are 16 elements. People don't have to take into consideration all the 16 elements. There are 4 or 5 parameters which needs to be taken. For example, the emergency response management, how in order to, if we consider a chemical which has that, how do we, what is the emergency response management parameter? So how do we handle that chemical in terms of any spill? So these are the 5-6 parameters, important parameters when considering an SDS management. And of course, I talked about the GHS labeling also, how we can effectively use these GHS in order to categorize the compounds. And the chemical handling practices, it covers about the inventory management, storage, and distribution, and personal hygiene of how we effectively handle the chemicals. And the engineering controls are very important in terms of like what engineering control are we bringing in, be it a chemistry environment, be it a biology environment. So based on that, we should be, if we don't have an effective engineering control, then I think we are really, we cannot avoid, the other things comes next, like all the other safety aspects, means in terms of PPEs, managing the PPEs, all comes next. But for first and foremost, I would say is the engineering control. Like I can give you an example where if you have to store it, acid-based acid cabinets or base cabinets, how they need to be stored, how are we working on the exhaust of those cabinets. And then coming to the chemical protective clothing, the PPE, particularly gloves. Here I would not be able to cover all the topics, but I have taken some examples from engineering controls and chemical protective clothing, that is gloves, what should be the criteria. So if you see on the engineering controls, there are 2 different types of engineering, like the ones, where the quantity of the containment is low, and where we need to clearly identify where it's a low containment or a high containment. The primary control has to be kept in for all the high containment areas. So when you go like in the for a high containment areas, we need to be very sure that uh, it removes contaminants from the stays away from the breathing zone, and should be very energy efficient and cost effective. The examples I can give or think of is the fume hoods, the spot exhaust, or the elephant trunk and the glove box. When it comes to low exhaust area, that is the low containment area, the worker is not very near, but he is close to the high containment area, but the toxicity is low. And the containment generation is more of a uniform. Like we need to consider, like what is the standard say that, 8 to 12 air changes depending on the lab time. So this has to be met. And then we need to have a clean, fresh air pushing down. And so the changes, this has to be practiced. We have to see it regularly. And how about the fume hood phase velocity, whether that phase velocity lies between 80 ppm to 120 when we are working with the fume hood, that the user has to be very conscious. Unless and until, first thing what he has to do before starting any kind of activity is like to check whether his hood velocity falls in this ppm. Otherwise, if not, you should not be able to work in that hood at all. Now, what are the risks involved? Like sometimes, generally the chemists, or they have the habit of, because they're frequently working in the hoods, they don't have the habit of lowering the sash. But you know how it will increase the risk of his exposure to, because there is an inadequate airflow, and it will not serve as a protective shield. Uh, so this has to be taken into consideration. And also when in times of power outage, which does not happen frequently, but he should be aware that when in case of power outage, the employee exposure will be more. So he should immediately secure and then evacuate the place, and always maintain that sash door should be lower to that whatever the safe level. And we have generally they have the tendency to store these kind of some tissue papers, aluminum foils, and some materials in that hood. So this will kind of block the airflow, which in the hood, which in case will affect the and it will kind of expose more to the employee. So those things need to be avoided. These things have to be kept in mind while people are really working in a fume hood. So coming to the next item, that is the gloves part. So most of the times, if you see the employee exposure is mostly because he is having a wrong glove selection. What we think is like one gloves fit all. Like in case of chemistry, in case of biology, maybe probably nitrile gloves is very suitable, and only in case of 10% or 5% of the case where he has to deal with a very biologically sensitive things, he can have other gloves. But in case of chemistry, we have a variety of chemicals, and the lack of there's always lack of knowledge on the gloves material, and we should have some selection criteria. See, I would like to quote here some example. Based on the nature of chemicals, one need to choose the gloves. For example, a nitrile gloves, we cannot wear it if you are using a nitric acid. A neoprene gloves has to be used. When it comes to a bromobenzene, we need to go for a Vuitton gloves. So if you see the selection criteria, like we need to kind of assess the hazard. Are we see so many types of material, like the cut resistant gloves, so many injuries are happening because of glass cuts or while washing the apparatus. So we should insist on the cut resistant gloves. And sometimes even while we are handling this low temperature, that is the liquid nitrogen or the dry ice, the cryogenic gloves has to be chosen. And the chemical property, it has to be, and in the SDS, we know what kind of chemical property, and then accordingly, the assessment has to be done. And then once we are assessing the material, then we also need to check on the permeability and the degradation of the gloves. And sometimes for a band 5 or band 4 type of compounds, the wearing a double gloves is very important, and wearing up to the cuff. Like, I would like to quote one real-time example here. Once a chemist was trying to handle this 2,4,6 trichloropiridine, where the traces, while he or she was removing the gloves, um, it kind of exposure happened to the skin, and blisters happen. And then this is because the improper gloves removal, the contamination had happened when she was trying to, first she removed the right hand gloves and then went to left hand gloves. The contamination usually happens when they shift to the left hand gloves. So these things should be, people should also know how to remove a gloves, and the and how, of course, the storage and inspection, and the proper training to the users on how it has to be. And then the disposal comes as the third part, like fourth part, like where people need to know how we have disposing at the right place. And so shifting gears from safety, quality also plays an important role, integral part of uh, the whole R&D setup. Safety and quality are kind of two eyes for any organization. There has to be, right from the product development, there has to be quality check at each point in activity. So it is an integral part to meet our laboratory, monitor its function, and ensure that consistency in performance. Of course, there are so many written procedures, and the whatever we write as an SOP, that should be reflected in our way of working. That is, the what we work should come as an SOP. What we write we should be able to follow that SOP. That the outcome of the process, we have to ensure that outcome of the process meets the standards. And the standards, the whatever we define it as a protocol, it has to be the chronological order of the activities. So if you see, this is the equipment standards, instrument standards, which usually followed in any kind of industry. First is in order to have any standards, it should be calibrated. Of course, the calibration and maintenance goes a long way. Unless the calibration is, and if there is any change, because in an R&D environment, we do see a lot of changes, and that change management is officially recorded, because in that we need to see if that change is going to really benefit, what is the purpose of the change, what are the benefits we are going to have, and the impact assessment of the change is going to happen, whether it is really going to improve the quality and compliance required. And the process design means, in the sense, how we design that process. And whenever we have that process design, there we request for an instrument or equipment, we should be aware of what we need to have in that equipment. That is the requirement, that is the user requirement specification, URS. Whether we are able to, when the instrument arrives at our place, whether whatever we required and whatever we had asked for, is it really there in that instrument? And then followed by the qualification and the validation, because these parameters are important to see. In a case of a HPLC, where the UV lamp is there, the vendor usually says that it will last for 5,000 hours. But when we put like an HPLC instrument on an auto calibration mode, any failure, we need to evaluate all the things which are causes of the failure. And if there are certain things like that, the UV lamp needs to be changed in 4,000 hours, and because of that the calibration is not proper, we need to change. We cannot go with what vendor is saying, right? So all this goes in hand with the equipment standards for an R&D. Well, now we have talked about the standards, the best practices, and now how to manage and sustain these standards. Like this is very important because in order to have the success of any organization, the implementing best practices is not just sufficient. How can we have it sustained? Continual improvement has to happen. So for that, the first is the governance and the structure. What I mean by governance and structure is like how do we really get this going? Like whether right from top to bottom approach in an organization, whether it is flowing from the top or getting, it has to do it in both ways, come from the top as well as go from the bottom. And then in order to have that, once we have established the governance and structure, whether we have a sustained training on that process. So that training thing is really important because unless and until we train our employees properly, because most of the times in any organization, well-growing organization, we see that year on year basis, we see some 20 to 25% growth. At the same time, we also see an attrition of 12 to 20%. So the constantly the population is kind of changing every time because we are getting new employees, we are getting rid of the old employees. So this, unless and until the training is not efficient, we'll not be able to achieve that continuous improvement. And coming to the mindsets and behaviors, more often how people take that. So that needs to be changed as well. What that we are doing, how they think that safety is a priority, why they think that quality is a priority. So unless we change the mindset and behavior, we will not be able to see the outcome as continuous improvement. So we covered on the safety part where we need to, based on the risk, we need to identify, have the safety aspects. Now quality and compliance management, and then the inventory management, it is has to be integrated with the safety and quality. And we also need to have a infrastructural benchmarking, like as and when we get the instrument, we don't have to buy each and everything, whatever is available. But are we going to have the right kind of instruments? Are we going to moderate the ratio of those instruments with respect to scientists? All this, and now in this world, automation is one thing which we need to really focus on. How can we improve the automation? How can we bring things in a more automated way? So this all will reflect in the process optimization, which is, as overall, we see the operational excellence of any organization. So if you see all this are covering under that, the management of change and auditing and emergency response, all should be process of that any system. So this is an onion ring model where the first is the red thing you see is the lab process, where the bench scientists are working in the lab. And unless and until they are supported by the equipments, proper equipments and the instruments by the E&M or maintenance team, it does not go very well. So that support has to be the integration between the scientists and the support function has to be go hand in hand. And then the utility systems and the maintenance, which also forms a very critical part, and the site system. The site system means that all the incident investigation, emergency response, auditing, the top management should be kind of, this is what I said when we say that bottom to top approach and top to bottom approach. This happens in onion ring model. So to summarize, customers are the core of everything. When we say, we need to kind of raise, we all saw that the improving awareness by our hazard communication, and how do we manage the risk, be it in terms of safety or quality, and how to minimize the health hazard with the exposure with respect to chemicals, all that we saw. And then engineering controls, which is very important aspect, and how are we following the standards? How should we keep in our back of our mind, like the standards are very important, and how to kind of best practices to manage the employee with the hazardous chemicals. And finally, the key takeaways I would say is it is not just important to have the best practices and processes to have our, the business continuity and excellence. Even if you have the best practices and processes, if you don't have the proper training cascade, everything fails there. It is as equivalent of not bringing the best practices and processes. And unless and until we don't measure the improvement, we don't know how are we performing that. So measuring metrics to measure improvement is also important, but at the same time, not a kind of putting pressure wherever we can. We need to kind of strike a balance when we take into R&D practices. So these are the key takeaways. Vijay, how am I on time?
Oh, you're pretty good on time. I just wish that you keep going on and on, Sridevi. That was a splendid session. Thank you so much. The questions are coming in the Q&A box. In case you're still wondering, you want to ask the question or not, now is your chance to drop it into the Q&A, and we'll pick it up. So, Sridevi, safety and quality are the two eyes of an organization. It has to go hand in hand. You can't choose one over the other. That was the key message that I got from this. Let's see what the people have to say. The first question is from GVVS Prasad.
Okay.
And his question is, how pre-startup safety review, PSSR, works in R&D labs?
Actually, it is very important because when we have imbibed this in our organization as well in Syngene, even for R&D labs. See, the pre-startup safety review has to be initiated from the user, because when a user wants to have in his mind that these are the requirements from the user, okay, he would have given the user requirement that these are the requirements. And then this has to be done along with our engineering maintenance as well as the safety department. This has to go together so that when the user has listed down the requirements, and when the design or the infrastructure is ready to operate, before operating, we need to have this PSSR done along with the E&M and EHS to validate whether are we having the engineering controls properly placed, or is it according to the safety standard, whichever I was mentioning, be it IBC guidelines, NFPA, or engineering controls, all that has been correctly placed. This has to be done from the safety aspect, and from the user aspect, he has to check whether, whatever the requirements according to his requirements has been correctly addressed. So this PSSR kind of helps the user that whether the infrastructure, what he has in mind, has properly come into shape.
All right, wonderful. Okay, this is a very interesting question. I'm not sure if it is the right place or the person, but nevertheless, I'll put it for you. It's from Gyanaranjan Sahu, and his question is, how can R&D prices be reduced?
Pardon?
How can R&D price be reduced?
Prices be reduced? Well, a very interesting question. I think I would say you need to pay the price if you are expecting a quality and safety aspect into it. So probably I don't have a very definitive answer for this right now, but I think if you are expecting the R&D delivery, what are your expectations, and then how any R&D organization is matching with your expectations. and what are the standards they are maintaining. So all this, I think, has to be evaluated before I comment anything on that.
Okay, I think it's more like asking how can we solve Bangalore traffic problems. So yeah, there's no
Exactly.
definitive and a straightforward answer to it.
Yeah,
Um,
and also the inflation, right? I can compare this with the inflation rate.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So people are now voting on the questions. So this is a user choice question, which is from Sujarvo Suryaputra. Is it important for R&D labs to follow accreditation or certification of QMS schemes?
Come again?
Is it important for R&D labs to follow certification of QMS schemes or accreditation?
Well, what I would say is like uh, many times what happens is we need to have some quality management standards, but not, we need to strike a balance. Most of the times what happens is the manufacturing processes gets overlaid on the R&D. So we need to kind of strike a balance where we need to custom make our QMS. That is the R&D, whichever the organization has to custom make according to the requirement, that whether what are all the requirements you think has to be with respect to quality management standards. So I think each organization has to custom make it, not exactly imbibe whatever is followed in manufacturing, because when it comes to R&D, what people expect is speed and innovation. That speed and innovation should, this kind of quality standard should not block that speed and innovation. So we need to kind of strike a balance between that, establishing, having some standards, at the same time it is not blocking our activity.
Okay, moving on to the next one. This is from Babu Pungavanam. How long one can store laboratory chemicals which are considered, okay, I think it's considered to be very unstable.
So we did this exercise in our organization, and when we say laboratory chemicals, you cannot just have a general term of a laboratory chemicals. So you need to kind of identify what category it belongs to. So what we did in our organization is classified into different zones, the most reactive, neutral, and depending upon like what chemical you are handling. For example, chemicals such as pyrophorics and the peroxides, we cannot store it for a long time. They tend to have some kind of degradation, which will cause in the explosion or something. So we need to have a faster sweeping rate for that. Whereas there are some chemicals which are which can stay for 20 years. I'm not telling store it for 20 years. If your storage capacity allows to store for 20 years, well, fine, and that's fine. But if your storage capacity you have, so you need to decide that mechanism, how often you need to do the sweeping for which type of chemicals. That you should work out for your organization, how you want to do that.
All right. So the next one is from Satyamurthy. You talked about the safety standards which are critical in labs. What is the good training frequency for the scientists on safe lab usage?
So when it comes to refresher training, I would say that we should have some kind of a training calendar which covers all aspects, that is chemical safety, or be it in if it is a biologist or biosafety related things. So annual calendar which covers different topics. So annually we should have this trainings, but covering different topics.
Annual and different topics. Moving on, Deepak AV asks, on a broad scale, can you please categorize the different lab arrangements and the regulations to comply with?
Different what, Vijay?
Lab arrangements. So categorize the different lab arrangements and what are the regulations you need to comply with? If it is too broad to answer, we can pick it up offline and then we'll put up the response on the website.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Another one from GVVS Prasad. Is it necessary to follow OSHA Process Safety Management Standard 29 CFR 1910.119 in R&D labs?
Well, it's a very interesting question. The 21 CFR, like sometimes, we don't have to strictly follow all this 21 CFR into the R&D. Sometimes it becomes, some aspects of it can be taken. For example, when the instruments are there, the user login, like in sometimes what happens is somebody messes up when we have a common login. So when we have a same user specific login, then we are able to identify if something has been wrong. This basically, that it is not very necessary to to follow the 21 CFR, but depending upon what you want to have, you can take some part of it to make it. In my opinion, this is what we want to follow.
Okay. Talking about standards, another one. Any specific Indian regulation standards available for ATEX oven lab, ATEX oven lab?
For explosive proof, right?
I'm not too sure.
Yeah.
This is from Elil Rajan R. Elil Rajan, if you want to sort of add to it, please type in. We'll come back to it. Okay, I'll move on to the next question, which is from Gyanaranjan Sahu. How can I become a research scientist in a pharma industry? My qualification is now Masters in Biotechnology.
What he wants to become, a research scientist.
In a pharma industry, but he is now qualified as a Master in Biotech.
Yeah, there are some opportunities there when see in the biochemist, those kind of things are still there in a in a safety assessment or in a different opportunities can be opened up in some organizations. It is possible.
Okay, everything is possible. Going back to Lil Rajan, this will be a final question. We are pretty much approaching the clock. So yes, the question was related to explosive fluids. I'll repeat the question for your benefit, Sridevi. Any specific Indian regulation standards available for ATEX oven lab, which is related to explosive fluids?
I don't know about the Indian standards, but slowly I think organizations are looking into having this kind of flame proof, particularly in some areas, when we are having the major critical areas like where hydrogenation lab, or in case of some solvent handling unit area. So those kind of areas, I think having the ATEX fittings is very important.
Okay. This question is closer to Kivani, so I thought I'll allow this. Do you think any changes or modification are required for the fume hoods to be used in the R&D lab currently?
Yeah, I think we had a lot of this discussion, right, Vijay, with you, like, we are also introduced a lot of things in the fume hood in the recent past. Like before fume hood was just a place where the exhaust used to be there, and some nitrogen and air connection and water connection. Now it is more than that. The standards have they have raised a real bar in the standards of the fume hoods. Like even having a modular fire extinguishers in the fume hood, where it can sense if the temperature is above some 57-64 degrees, it immediately splashes the ABC powder. And even we tend to do a lot of reactions in the fume hood and overnight reactions. How can we kind of make use of Internet of Things to to monitor the reactions, or to operate the reactions offline. So I think these are all some of the things which can be thought of.
Wonderful. So that was a question from Babu Pungavanam. There are a few more that are here, but given the paucity of time, we'll take it offline. So Pavitra Mahale and Saravanan KK, we will put in our responses offline on our website. Yeah. So with that, that's pretty much the time we have for today. So, like I mentioned, all the unanswered questions, we will take it up offline and we'll publish on our website, which is kiwani.in. And the video recording of this webinar and a copy of the presentation will also be made available to you. And there is only one way you can know about it when we are publishing. That is by following us on our social media channels. And you'll see the LinkedIn handle right there on your screen. So it's LinkedIn company Kiwani. So just go and follow us. There's a lot of interesting stuff keeps happening on our social media channels, right? So with that, Sridevi, thank you very much for making time to join us today. I'm sure given the amount of questions that came in, people found it very useful too. And we hope to see you very soon with us.
Yeah,
thank you so
Vijay,
much
for giving this opportunity. I would like to thank Kiwani for providing this opportunity, and this is the first webinar I am giving. So thank you for providing this opportunity. I'd also like to thank my organization, Syngene, for for providing me this valuable experience. And also I would like to thank the audience for those for your patience and for your wonderful questions. Thank you so much.
Well, I can't believe this was your first webinar. This is like a 6 in the first ball. Yeah. So thank you. And everyone else who have joined in today, thank you for taking the time. We'll see you the next time. This is Perspectives, a thought-led initiative by Kiwani. Thank you and goodbye.